people are starting to see more and more logistics as a win-lose kind of game, a competition. Shippers, people with freight are beating up carriers and brokers for lower rates in times when the shippers have a bunch of demand. And then all of a sudden there's too much demand and not enough supply. And now these carriers and brokers are saying this is their chance to win this win-lose competition. And if you look at data in any market, including the US, over 20, 30, 40 years, no one's really winning. We're just going and riding a roller coaster of feast and famine. But in the meantime, we know that there are ways to do things differently, and people are doing that and have been doing it at a small scale that allow both sides to win.
Welcome to Entrepreneur's Handbook Podcast, where we share inspiring startup stories with practical takeaways for you, the listener. Today we have with us Anshu Prasad, who's the CEO and co-founder of Leaf Logistics. They started 5.5 years ago and manage over 100 million in transportation, and are only just getting started. How are you doing today, Anshu?
I'm doing great, Amardeep. Great to talk to you.
So, I want to dive straight into your story and also how you got started, because you had a long career in consulting and other industries. What made you become an entrepreneur in the first place?
Honestly, it was seeing the problem over and over again and talking to people about it and saying, if no one's going to do something about it, maybe we should. And so I had about 18 years of pretty firsthand experience, kept coming back to the same problem. Everyone looks at transportation as a win-lose game. And there was something that could be done with today's tools and data differently. And after talking about it and trying to kind of put the plan together for a while, really saw that there were people smarter than me that believed that something different should be done, and they wanted to work on this together. That gave me the impetus to say, okay, the time is now.
And how hard was it? Because obviously you had a very good job, what you were doing at A.T. Kearney, and you're obviously doing pretty well, and you had a family. So to go from that to then starting your own thing and all the risk associated with that, was that a hard choice, or did you just feel like this is the right time, this is it?
So it was hard in its own way, but I spent the time with my board at home, my family. And there were two things. One is I had sort of had the experience of watching my wife, who has been very successful in the work that she's done, and she started things and kind of taken them to maturity and successfully passed them on so that they could be ongoing concerns. So that success of building something that sort of outlasted you and the satisfaction that comes from it was inspiring. So that was one thing. The second one was, frankly, I was getting to the point where, I was getting frustrated. There was this what seemed to me an obvious need that needed to be addressed. And yes, I loved my job and I loved my team and the colleagues that we had kind of come together at Kearney to do work together. But we weren't going to be in a position, just frankly, it was a 100-year-old place that was very good at doing what it does. To kind of stop that beautiful machine and kind of do something different wasn't really logical. And so once I kind of had that realization and say, look, I need to go and bet on this particular idea with people who want to work on this specific thing, I kind of got that push also from the home board, right? To say, if you don't do this, you're going to be miserable and you're going to make us miserable because you keep talking about it and we don't want to hear anymore. So please go do this. And so I had both the inspiration, but also the push from the back to say, please go do this. And that helped a lot.
You mentioned there about doing it with people who want to do this as well. So how did you find your co-founders? How did you find the right team to begin with?
So that was a really, really important part of the journey for me. So when I mentioned, talking to people who are smarter than I am, I kind of made it a project, if you will, right? I had a period of sabbatical from Kearney after a certain number of years as a partner. And I took that time to go and talk to 50 odd people. So I built up a list of, people who would need to work on this with me, or at least I wanted to sniff test the idea. Did they believe that this could be done and could have a big impact? Prospective customers, both buyers and sellers of transportation, really brilliant people in the space who have tons of respect for, and they would do the same, right? So pressure test the idea, but also tell us, would they work with us in the early days? But I didn't know all of these people. And so the third group was investors, because I felt like to do this well and to really scale it where technology and data were, there was something about venture scaling as opposed to bootstrapping, which, I had been part of earlier in my career, that this needed to kind of happen more quickly to really build the momentum. And to do that work, I needed to talk to people who understood that. that industry. So again, I just got on that odd list of 50, I asked people for like, who are the people that you've worked with, other entrepreneurs in some cases, who, you feel would really understand this and would give me really good advice, would lead. So I did that legwork. And in that process, I found co-founders, I found early customers, and I found, who became some of my earliest investors and backers.
And with those investors in particular as well, because you obviously raised quite a significant amount of capital at the moment. What was that process like for you? Was it something which, once you started pitching, you got the momentum, or like how much rejection did you get? Did it take a while to convince people that this is, because you said you did a lot of legwork, but sometimes when you do a sniff test and people are chatting about it casually versus when they're going to put their money in, can be a different conversation.
It completely is. And it's night and day. Suffice it to say, there was a lot of failure, but, and I think part of that is like, in the process of talking to these really smart people, these thoughtful people, they always had 2 or 3 people for you to talk with. So when people really love the problem, and I loved the problem, right? Like I didn't love the answer quite yet, right? And certainly the way in which it was being presented, my pitch wasn't great. I'm a reforming consultant still after so many years. So like all my slides had, 8 font and a bunch of information on it, and people needed to understand the key point very quickly and move to the next thing. And I was not good at telling that story. And so I needed that iteration. So I think much like we, even now at Leaf, need to be very humble in the face of the enormous challenge and the opportunity we're pursuing. I knew I didn't know. I knew that the expert was on the other side of the table, and I was actively trying to learn. And, there were moments where I would go in and I would pitch to, who people would consider, world-class investors. And they'd be like, I think I understand what you're saying, but I would rip that entire deck up and start from scratch. And after you get over the jolt of that, because, I was pretty good at PowerPoint and consulting, but that wasn't the point. It wasn't the tool. It was more just understanding what is being asked of you in this particular context that I needed to learn and, frankly, grow into. And so, no, it was every single round of investment that we've raised, there's been a very long list of folks that I've kind of gone to based on advice and recommendations from other people, and frankly been an active listener for, and 2, asking for advice before it was time to fundraise. And when it came time to fundraise each round, some of those folks already had conviction. They were already telling me what I needed to kind of figure out to help them, bring their investment committee or whatever along for the ride. But it was really about, I think it's the old adage of, if you go out and ask for money, you'll get advice. But if you go out and ask for advice, you sometimes get money.
Looking at that as well. So when you were doing that fundraising, obviously you said you had to go through multiple iterations there. What did you learn along that way? What was the final kind of story you told investors? And you realized that this is really compelling and this is getting people to pay attention. What was the difference in how you crafted it?
Yeah, so I think it depended on the stage, but it was really important. We talk about it as having 2 competing ideas in your head at every time. It was really important to have a vision and a mission for something that could be very different, not just a little bit better, a little bit cheaper, a little bit faster, but very different, that would be transformative in its impact. I.e., it could be a big business, right? The venture capitalists are looking for things that will matter, that will stand the test of time, that could be big businesses. Otherwise, it doesn't make sense to place, the bets that they place. But also, the other competing idea, and it's different in the seed stage versus the Series B stage, but what has actually been done now to show, that the idea works or it resonates, or you have product market fit or you have go-to-market fit. So, what have you done that gives us reason to believe that vision and mission can be realized? And so it's been really, honestly, it's been illuminating to understand from folks before you actually get to that stage what the criteria for those 2 things are. What makes for, we're charting our path to a massive business that could have a big transformative impact. But what are the proof points that we need to show here that you would understand and finally find the conviction to really back? And it depends. There's some, investors or customers for whom the thing they're looking for is not the thing we're working on, and that's okay. It's better to know that earlier than to kind of get there and kind of basically be talking past each other. So it's those 2 competing ideas. In the seed stage, it was very much about the fact that, frankly, this is our life's work. It's like me and the early team here, like we spent the good bulk of our careers picking at this problem, and we know something. There's this sort of pithy way of saying this that one of our investors likes to talk about. What are your earned secrets? Like, you did the work, and what did you learn that other people don't really know? And you know, from that secret, what is the insight that you've driven that allows you to kind of go out there and do something different and potentially massive? Great. That was very important. But then over time, we're supposed to mature as a business. I'm supposed to mature as a leader. We should know more. What do we know? Are we proving the right things that tell us that we're on the path? And therefore, the right investor kind of comes along if they believe that that path is worth going down.
So the storytelling and the PowerPoint side of things is something you had to adjust after going from consulting into being an entrepreneur. But what other things do you think you had kind of a rude awakening to? Because obviously you'd managed teams before, you'd done a lot of the management side of things before, I'd guess. But what were some of the challenges which maybe you weren't prepared for and you had to learn quickly on the job?
Yeah. Well, look, the first and most fundamental thing is, without having the brand and the history and the proven track record of a Carney, going out there and saying there's this thing that this company is doing, it's like, well, that's cute, that's interesting, but tell me after you've done it, right? Like, come back to me after you've done it. So really, one of the things that we thought about very deliberately from before getting started was, well, who would you pay attention to that would give you a sense that this is actually happening now in a way that hasn't happened before? And that was one of the reasons why we focused so much on those prospective early customers. I mean, again, going back to the late 90s, some of us worked together at a company that built some early technology that happened to be in supply chain and some complex category procurement. But it was important that companies like Bristol Myers and Unilever used that technology. So that was a lesson we had learned from a while back to say, people are going to be figuring out, is this theory or is this practical? And if practical for them would mean there's a strong signaling from companies that they know and respect are considered world-class and rightfully are. And if those world-class companies are willing to adopt something that they think could be making them world-class 5 or 10 years from now, I should take a closer look. So that was one big thing, is to say, we don't have a pedigree to lean on here, but some of the work we're doing might give a strong signal, and whom we're doing that work with will be important. So that was one. The second thing is that pedigree also translates to who comes on board. Like, it takes a certain kind of risk appetite is a nice way to put it, but a little bit of crazy, I like to say, that compels you to join a company with 5 or 10 people working at a problem. And so what was really important there was, just like with investors, the mutual conviction that, like, look, we could work together, we could learn from each other, and we could all do something more than 10 of us could do on our own. It sounds a bit trite and hokey, but it's really like there are people who are excellent managers of 50 or 5,000 people that wouldn't work in that 10-person mindset. And there are people in that 10-person mindset who honestly would chafe at managing 500 people. And so it's a little bit of kind of really figuring that out, like, who are these builders when there isn't anything built yet, and who are the professional managers that kind of take on different responsibilities, and all are not the same.
How do you think your roles adapted over time? So obviously you went from, like you said, managing large teams, then going to a startup where it was only a few people, and then now Leave Logistics is scaling again, and I imagine it's going to scale even bigger in the future. How has that your role changed, and also what you're enjoying the most in that time period?
Yeah. And so maybe on that latter bit first, I mean, I think part of my personal impetus for coming in and doing this, building from zero again, was that building thing that I really enjoyed. I had a chance to do that at that startup in the late 90s at a certain stage. And, and looked back on it, reflected back on it. What I really enjoyed was that early stage work with some of these brilliant people, some of whom are working at Leaf with us. And, it's being able to learn from and grow with some of those people that got me personally sort of energized. And I kind of had that opportunity even at Carney to kind of work in a practice or in a practice area that needed to be built and then scaled. I just enjoyed that. So that was a personal motivation for me to kind of be back at the building stage. But, I'm still very much learning. I keep telling the team that there's a 100-foot ladder and I'm on rung 2. And, it's not logical that any of us should be able to scale to, like, we're talking about building a company, and that's amazing to kind of, but human beings don't usually scale very well. There's a lot of complexity to that. But that's our job. Like, I learned the term growth mindset from my kid because they were drilled into that concept in school. But really, the idea that we're supposed to grow, and that's frankly again like the building phase. I mean, you kind of peel that back. It's you're assimilating information. You're growing as a human, very very fast as the team grows. And it's super fun, right? So like I see this as a growth and learning journey for me and for everybody else. And I'm very much on the second rung of the 100-foot ladder.
And let's say you were going to start logistics again from scratch today. So you'd spent another 5 years at Kearney before you decided to take the leap. What do you think you wish you could have told yourself? What would you maybe do differently if you had all the lessons that you've learned over the last 5 years?
So one of the things, I mean, so 5 years in, I'm not sure I would have is one thing, right? Because it starts to get to a point where some of the calculus changes. I think there's a lot to be said for the timing. And that's a matter of luck sometimes. Like not pretend that, like I had some crazy crystal ball, but there was a time at which if I'd started a little bit earlier, I might have taken on and been tempted to take on more capital. And then you start to build some habits that become really hard to, so like the timing worked out. And so, 5 years later, 5 years earlier might not have been the best timing. What I would say, I think reflecting back on this, and frankly, I asked the same question you just asked me to other folks who are a little further along in their entrepreneurial journey. And some of the advice I got there was, I wish after going through a couple of funding rounds that I'd brought in an institutional investor that understood venture capital and private equity better than I did. Like I was trying to learn on the job. I wish I had a partner at the table with me. So I took that learning to heart, and, we raised institutional capital earlier than quote unquote was in our plan. And that has worked out really well. Like we've worked with partners that have taught us more about how the investment process works and who to think about and how to partner with folks much faster than we would have learned on the job. And so that same sort of, what I would have done is, probably done a bit more scaffolding building, 50 odd people. Maybe there's a bit more of those 50 people are introducing us to 150 people. How do we build a process of, getting the momentum built behind Leaf and what was called logistics exchanged in beta, so that it actually taps into that building sort of momentum or network of people who are invested in this idea being successful. In retrospect, we could have done more there.
And looking at the investment side there, if people are listening right now who are considering getting venture capital for their startup, and like I said, where they don't have anybody that they know that can advise them what to do exactly, have you got any advice for things they should look out for that maybe you wish you knew back in the day? So you said about getting institutional investors on board, but is there anything else, or what do the institutional investors teach you?
Yeah. I mean, I think the biggest thing is I think it's just being curious and there's a passion behind the idea. Well, you should be unafraid of going and asking people for advice. And what you'll find are people are much more generous than you would expect because they understand how lonely a struggle this is at the beginning stages. And so get out there and just do the asking as opposed to sit back and try to craft the perfect whatever, story, pitch, whatever. You'll get feedback on the story and pitch from that conversation. But I think there's no substitute for going out there and iterating, like with everything we do in the actual building of the technology. But I think in the conversation, the idea and the shaping and improvement of the idea, one of the things I also learned from some of those early investor conversations, early entrepreneur conversations as well, is, the world has shifted a little bit to say, you got to make the idea better. You have to go out there and test the idea and get feedback on the idea. I grew up, with the mindset of the idea is intellectual property. It's like, well, no. It turns out the idea is conceptually very similar to a dozen other ideas. So in my list of 50 were people who had tried this idea 20 years ago or 10 years ago, and I wanted to learn from them why it didn't work for them and what they would do. And some of those people became volunteers for continuing to give advice over the course of the journey because they wanted to see the idea actually germinate. And timing wasn't in their control, but maybe the timing is better now. And so, like what I would suggest to all entrepreneurs, like anyone starting out, is you don't know how many people you do know, right? Like one of the amazing things about LinkedIn is it shows you how interconnected we all are. And you are 1 to 2 degrees away from being able to at least ask for the time from pretty much anyone you'd want to meet. So do it. There's no substitute. There's no perfection in the plan. Just go out there and do it.
When it comes back to that, the worst thing somebody can say to you is no or ignore you, right? And it can happen all the time, right? So I might get some huge people on this podcast, and there'll be some other people just ignore me completely. And that's okay, right? It's often not personal. And I think sometimes people are worried about rejection because they take it personally. It's like, if you're cold outreaching to somebody, they don't know who you are, they don't know much about you, they might have something else going on in their life. There's a million reasons why they're rejecting you without it being because you're inadequate. And you've got to kind of not let yourself jump to that conclusion of, if somebody says no to me, it's a problem with you. It could just be so many other things, right? And you mentioned timing again there, and I want to bring up the P word in some way that came up in the last few years, the pandemic. And how much of an impact did that have on the growth of your business with the logistics space? Because obviously logistics were a bit all over the place during that period.
Yeah. So in some ways, it was a tailwind. It was a helpful thing because after everyone was done being sort of an armchair epidemiologist, everyone became a logistician, right? In the pandemic, like, why don't we have baby formula on the shelf? Why is it hard to get toilet paper on the shelf? Like, everyone wanted to ask that question. In a normal, quote unquote, time, we just expect these things to work. And so all of a sudden there was this bright light being shined on the fact that logistics doesn't quite work the way that people assume it would, right? Like, you turn the faucet, you expect water to run out of it. Why is logistics not work this way? It should work. So that was a helpful thing for some of what we were talking to some prospects and customers and investors about, that no, this might be the time for us to fundamentally fix some of the waste and inefficiency in logistics. But it was also a headwind in a way that, again, we were fortunate to have the timing of when we had raised and what we had built, and not overbuilt in some cases, so that we closed our B round in January before some of the changes in the investment climate in this year. So sometimes it's just better to be lucky than good, but it was also helpful that we were raising like a $30 million round as opposed to a $300 million round, because we would have just been in a different position. That all said, at the end of the day, there are very thoughtful people in this industry, and including investors, who know that the fundamental changes will take time, and there is patience around kind of building the right thing as opposed to the slightly cheaper, faster, quick thing. And it takes legwork and conversation and really kind of getting into the brass tacks kind of dialogue to figure out where is there that alignment towards where we're going, versus we actually see the same problem, but we see different solutions to it, and we're wasting each other's time. I mean, to your point around the failure rate, if there's 150 conversations you have with prospective investors in a funding round, you get 5 or 10 term sheets. That's an incredible success. As success rate, that's a very low success rate. You failed a lot, but I don't see that as like failing. Like, we should expect that most people, like, if you're really shooting for a big idea, almost by definition, most people don't agree with you. They don't see the same thing you do. So, kind of expect, like, if everyone agreed with you, then maybe it isn't all that different, the thing that you're going after.
You mentioned there about the big idea as well. And obviously what you're building is a huge idea, potentially, on how you could change the market. For people who maybe aren't too familiar with logistics and transport, can you say like what Leaf Logistics is making such an impact and why it can continue to make such an impact?
Yeah. So stop me if I ramble here, because I do love this problem a lot. But we've been working at this space for quite some time. And really, our experience has been that over the last 2 or 3 decades, people are starting to see more and more logistics as a win-lose kind of game, a competition. Shippers, people with freight are beating up carriers and brokers for lower rates in times when the shippers have a bunch of demand. And then all of a sudden, there's too much demand and not enough supply. And now these carriers and brokers are saying this is their chance to win this win-lose competition. And if you look at data in any market, including the US, over 20, 30, 40 years, no one's really winning. We're just going and riding a roller coaster of feast and famine. But in the meantime, we know that there are ways to do things differently, and people are doing that and have been doing it at a small scale that allow both sides to win. You can literally pay truck drivers twice as much in well-planned and scheduled transportation. You can literally get the unprecedented levels of service and 10% or more structural cost reductions. I mean, when you're spending $500 million on trucking and you get a 10% cost reduction, it's a big deal for a food company, for example. Those are things that are possible, but they haven't been done to scale. So for Leaf to create a data foundation on which that can be done at scale, that's what's exciting about it. The volume that has been pushed through Leaf has 10x'd in the last year. We see an opportunity to do that again over the next couple of years. And that's still a very small part of this market. It's really building the data and the technology infrastructure to do this for billions and tens of billions of dollars, to take this over $100 billion of waste in our industry and wring it out for the benefit of both buyer and seller. This is not a win-lose competition. It's a coordination problem. You need data and technology to kind of not just see that, but to execute that way.
And for me as well, correct me if I'm wrong in my understanding here, but it's beyond just the buyer and the seller as well, right? Because if you're decreasing the shipping costs and things like that for people, that benefits me and you as well. Because I'm guessing you've got the same thing in the States right now as we have in the UK of inflation is not looking particularly pretty. And a lot of that, some of that does come down to the shipping and the transport costs and all that. So if we're then reducing that, it then helps your average person as well. So it's a nice bigger picture goal, I think, of what you're doing.
Oh, it absolutely is. Yeah. And there is and we think about that, in the most tangible ways from a sustainability standpoint in two ways. One is all the wasted capacity, 30 to 50% of transportation capacity is being wasted. And that is wasteful emissions, a lot of empty miles being driven, which is driving down driver wages and some of the things I talked about. But it's also just wasteful emissions. So if you could knit together this grid of transportation and actually keep the truck moving and loaded with empty cans from the can manufacturer to filled cans from the beverage maker to transport to the retailer to get it out to the stores, and that truck keeps moving and loaded, driver makes more money, the carriers are more profitable, and the shippers have saved money, and we all have benefited from a meaningful reduction in empty miles and the associated emissions, which will have a huge impact on the carbon footprint of our industry, which, let's face it, logistics is not a poster child for carbon efficiency. But there's also that future of work angle. The second angle here is if you're increasing driver wages by 2x, drivers don't need to quit their jobs and turn over like they do in our industry, because it's actually more of a sustainable living wage. I mean, we have to make, as technologies like electrification and autonomous and others enter into our industry, to think about the humans. And if those humans are not being kind of repurposed to work that actually is more rewarding, more meaningful, and they're being better remunerated for it, technologies don't just happen to people. People don't get disrupted, right? We have to choose in a lot of ways to adopt these technologies. So we see those two angles as having sort of a greater good than beyond just making things a little bit better or meaningfully better for the buyer and seller. Exactly to your point. And frankly, the reason why we think of ourselves as a platform business is we're not going to do this alone. Not only are our customers involved, but partners, people who are building the next set of tooling and technology and data that will be useful for this orchestration. We consider what we're doing setting up to be the air traffic controller, but you need data and you need tools and you need other people to use those data at scale to really make this transformation happen in a few years as opposed to a few decades.
And one thing I find interesting as well is all of this is just in the United States. And do you have plans in the future to try and expand that? Because obviously the US is one major source of where some of these inefficiencies are because of how much goes through the States. But there must be so much you can do on a global scale as well.
Yeah, absolutely. This problem rhymes in other markets. I mean, I had a chance to live in your hometown and work on this problem in Europe for a number of years. I had a chance with my colleagues at Carnegie to kind of see this problem close up in literally all around the world. There's a similarity. I mean, obviously there's differences and nuances to those just different markets, but this idea that we've gone down this path of fragmentation and kind of, which side has the hammer right now in the negotiation, and we're focused on reducing the rate, but we're not actually looking at the total cost. And that total cost, if it's not something that's sustainable and allows both sides to build healthier businesses, when carriers go bankrupt, guess what? The shippers suffer, right? They get poor service and of course they scramble and costs go up. So if we can build a much more, not just resilient, but an anti-fragile industry around the world. So yes, we do have ambitions to do this work in other geos. Right now, we're expanding some of the work we're doing in the US across different types of transportation, because that coordination problem starts to expose even larger inefficiencies that exist that we've all kind of known about, but we haven't had the bandwidth or the data to do much about. But now we're starting to expose some of that. So there is a little bit of a method to the madness here. What we're trying to do as a business is not lose focus, right? There's 65 odd people at Leaf working on a very hard problem with some of the most demanding customers that are household names. These are well-led and well-run companies. The challenge is daunting alone, but these companies themselves for the last 2 to 3 years are saying, look, this problem looks very similar to us when we look at Europe, when we look at Latin America. When are you guys going to do that? So, well, we will, but we want to partner with you to kind of do that in a way that we're not just talking about doing it, we're doing it with you in Europe. So we definitely do intend to have other types of transportation coordinated, but also other geographies addressed over time.
I think the great thing about that is because obviously you work with multi-internationals, you can almost be guaranteed clients for those new areas you move in, which obviously helps in terms of logistics, if I use that word. But you don't have to go to that new area, try to find new clients and build it up from scratch, because the people that you help at the moment often have branches in those other places as well. And what I was going to ask here as well is, how do you pick? You said you're going through different modes of transport. How did you pick those first ones to target? And then how do you pick what you're going to go into next? What's the decision-making process there?
Yeah, so we actually let the data really guide us. So before we had the $27 billion worth of data that people have shared with us, we let sort of our experience kind of at least pick the first landing spot. We knew that there was a lot of inefficiency and it's hurting both sides. It's a question of, in this quarter, which side is it hurting more? And we'd kind of seen that roller coaster ride for several years of our respective careers. And what we knew was, 60 to 80%, depending on the company, we're looking at the value of the goods that are being transported in some industry verticals are showing up on a truck. So trucking matters. And for these companies, getting the trucking cost wrong, second or third largest cost in the entire operation, made or broke the year, right? So we knew that there was this was a big problem, and they knew it at the leadership level, and yet they were still doing what everybody else was doing. And so there was a place that, if we just talked to a handful of people in this targeted, focused area, we could at least get our start. When we look for the next areas, we look for the data to say, this trucking work that we're doing sits next to, so the dry trucking or ambient trucking sits next to refrigerated. There is a coordination opportunity between these two that isn't being attacked at scale. Or there's intermodal boxes, containers that ride on the back of a train, right on the rails, and can now be put on the back of a chassis that goes on the road. Now that starts to bleed into and potentially can be coordinated with trucking. Again, at the high level, we've known that and people have known that, but now we have the data to say, where can that be done? Where is it the most advantageous? You can get some of those early adopters using these insights. So it's really letting the judgment at the beginning to sort of say, this is our life's work. Let's figure out a place where it kind of makes sense. It's a no-brainer to at least get started. Now we're systematically, and it's actually harder to prioritize which area next than it is to say, is there an opportunity? There's a lot of opportunity out there, but systematically working towards this through this transformation, we're also letting our customers sort of sit around the table and guide us. Like, yes, to your point, this problem is acute in other geographies, but this problem is also acute in this other part of my supply chain. What should we go after? This is what we think from a Leaf perspective, what would be valuable to you. And if you've got a 2 or 3 customers saying, hey, we'll work on that next thing, that also gives us a lot more confidence and conviction. That's the next step.
Yeah, and I'm thinking about my own consulting days and doing that all case study interviews where you kind of separate out the costs and what's the biggest area for cost savings. And so often I remember I used to just overlook logistics and transport and that kind of area. And it's one of those areas which, like, I guess traditionally you would say is like quite unsexy, right? Is that you don't necessarily have people like, oh, I love logistics. But as you've been talking, you can just tell that you actually do love logistics and it's so interesting to you. And you think in some ways, being passionate about that area, which maybe other people aren't, is like a real competitive advantage because you've worked in it for so long, like you said, and you're a founding team. And I guess my thought process here is for people listening is everybody's trying to go sometimes after the really sexy industries and like the new things, whatever like that. But there's these huge, massive industries that maybe don't have innovation yet that are really ripe for that. And did you feel that when you're going into it, like you've got like, yeah, this is a really big opportunity that people aren't looking at enough?
Yeah, and I think that's certainly helpful, to kind of think about sort of the unsexy areas. But I think to your other point, you have to love the problem. You have to really kind of like want to work the problem. I mean, we have a ton of not just experience, but appreciation for the people we've worked with over the course of and these are some of the smartest, hardest working people. There's something like 5 million white collar workers who work in freight and logistics in the US. We talk about the truck drivers, and that's hugely important. But there's twice as many white collar workers working this problem every single day. This is a hard job. And these are some very, very smart people. And so, there are these weird insights that almost by coincidence, I think, we get over time. But you do have to love the problem, right? Because just the fact that it's unsexy and maybe has been overlooked, there are probably reasons why there's complexity and nuance, and there certainly is in transportation and logistics. That said, you can't get away from the fact that it's not all that sexy. My 16-year-old keeps making jokes about dad and trucking all the time, and they're not wrong.
And even along those lines, how do you think maybe people can be encouraged to look into those industries more, the ones that maybe aren't always in the headlines, but there's actually like a lot of value being made there and a lot of people doing great work? And is there anything which maybe, let's say you're going to start another startup today or tomorrow, and like, let's say Leaf didn't exist, what other ideas would you have where a problem you love or a problem where you think this needs to be solved and nobody's doing enough in it?
Yeah, no, I think that's always been a fascination of mine, and kind of working with people who do that for a living, looking for those ideas and figuring out if. So the 2 or 3 questions that those people have kind of taught me that they look for are, is this a big idea, right? Like, if you kind of think about an uncovered area or an area that doesn't seem to have the right, is there a way to kind of truly transform it, or are you going to kind of come in and put some lipstick on the pig, right? The second is, why now? Like, what are the conditions today versus 5 years ago, maybe 5 years from now, that make this the time to execute this big idea? And then thirdly, is this a big business, right? And, it's not because I'm maniacally focused on, and honestly, I don't even talk about very deliberately our value, because we're just getting started, as you said before. But if these insights are right, and all of the folks, not just at Leaf, but the people we're working with, kind of come along for this journey, at the end of the day, is this a big business that has a big impact? I think those 3 questions are worth asking. And, some great ideas in underserved areas might not be big businesses. There might be some areas where, like, critical pieces of what the ingredients are that are necessary to execute that idea aren't quite ready yet. And so I look for those 3 things, again, talking to people who see thousands of great ideas come through, but they don't necessarily tick those boxes.
And then looking at the future now. So obviously we know you want to potentially enter more different forms of transport, more geographies. But what else should we be looking out for? What might be headlines in a few years' time about what Leaf Logistics has been up to?
So I think the couple of things are more of the things that I alluded to in the sustainability kind of broad umbrella. One is the equivalent of this many trucks or this many cars have been taken off the road because we're now coordinating transportation across the grid. And Leaf Logistics has helped to make some of that possible. Similarly, I'd love to see, driver retention is through the charts, because we're still going to need human divers for the foreseeable future to do some critically important things where you need human judgment behind the wheel, local deliveries, local pickups in urban centers. And, no matter how the technology evolves, humans are going to need to play a key role. And then there's the white collar workers, their work becoming much more meaningful. There are amazing programs now that didn't exist, frankly, when I got into supply chain, and certainly the number or the quality that they exist now, where people are coming out trained in supply chain and logistics and with data skills. And those folks are going to be wanting to build their careers and do things in their careers that people today do would not be acceptable to those talented new folks that are coming in. So, like, what are these future jobs? And that requires retraining some of the folks that do those jobs today. So the headlines around, now we can move 10 times the trucking with 1/10 the person involved, but the other people that are in supply chain are now working on adjacent problems. They're working on, well, what happens upstream with kind of coordinating manufacturing and production? How do we get the customer satisfaction? Because I've talked to my retail customer and sync things up with them. We're doing more strategic work, less tactical manual work. And those people are retrained and reskilled to do that. We'd love to be part of that, right? So kind of exposing where there's value. Some of our customers right now, already early customers, are asking, if you could tell me what the impact would be to my business or to my customer if I shifted this from an afternoon appointment to a morning appointment. They're now understanding that Leaf can give them those insights, and they can go to those customers and to their own internal stakeholders. These people weren't in the room before. I mean, transportation was doing what it was doing, trying to get through the day, get through the next day. Those questions didn't get asked. Now with data, like, the job changes, people's work changes, and their ability to impact their businesses and what the businesses are trying to do changes. That's the kind of stuff we'd love to be a part of.
Yeah, it's really interesting what you said about retraining as well, because obviously that is a big part of it. Whenever there's new technology comes in and it makes things more efficient. But then, like I said, there are other adjacent things available, and it's how to get people involved in that, because then, like I said, then if you've got these people's minds working on problems next door to it, then you're improving the overall ecosystem. And like, I want to give you the opportunity as well to shout out anybody that you think is doing amazing stuff, or they've helped you in your business, that you think maybe doesn't get enough attention, or like our listeners should be going to them and checking out what advice they're giving about entrepreneurship.
Well, there are so many people that I listen to, try to find time to find time on their calendars too, to kind of, listen and learn from. But I think in broad terms, I think, what's happening in fintech is really fascinating. So there's a guy called Sanjeev Galita who, leads this group called Money 2020, which convenes a lot of really bright folks in the fintech world. Sanjeev is very thoughtful about what is happening in industry, but also how finance is kind of like this undercurrent to so many things that need to be changed, including logistics. How do these things interplay to kind of make the transformations faster? There are brilliant people working in supply chain and transportation. Sean Henry is one, Scott Ruffin's another. These folks are imagining a different future, and they've done interesting things already, and they're just kind of getting started. And one of my friends and colleagues and fellow board member here, but someone I've worked with for a long time in my career, Ari Ohalvo, who runs Reef Technologies, has built a really interesting business already, but he's got great ambitions and long-term plans. But he also has incredible sort of wisdom around how he's gotten to where he's gotten. Reef has been a really fascinating journey to watch, but also to learn from for me personally. So those folks immediately come to mind, but we only have so much time here. I could keep rambling. There are lots of people that people should be reaching out to.
I think it might have been before we started recording. We also mentioned that your wife has done a lot of amazing stuff too.
Yes, she has. She's probably the most successful entrepreneur I know. She started a couple of nonprofits that have, I think the test of them is, well after her time with those nonprofits is over, they continue to be very successful doing the work, growing, scaling, and healthy businesses in their own right. So just learning from her and watching her kind of build things, but also kind of understand the things that she can do disproportionately well, and then bringing the right teams in to kind of continue to kind of execute against the mission. She's been a fascinating person to learn from. So Sayu Bhojwani is definitely somebody you should go find and listen to her TED Talk, if nothing else.
I had to ask you again there, because I wanted to get you out of the doghouse. I was like, you can't do shout-outs and not include your wife.
That's a very good point. No, thank you for that.
So, like, for the listeners now, like, if they want to follow more about you and Leaf Logistics and see your story and where you're going to go, where should they go to?
Yeah, so look, I think Leaf has a bit of a presence on Twitter, and we share some stuff on LinkedIn. There'll be more coming, not just from us, but from some of the people we work with. So please continue to follow the Leaf story at leaflogistics.com, but also on Twitter and on LinkedIn. I am not the most prolific social media person out there, but you can certainly find me on Twitter at Anshu P, and you can find me on LinkedIn as well. But between the various different ways that Leaf is getting the story out about what we're doing, but more importantly, what our partners and our customers are doing, that is probably the place I'd go first.
Awesome. Thank you so much for coming on.
Thank you. Thanks so much for having me, Amriti.